Show us your papers is a phrase with sinister connotations. The COVID passports are already on the horizon. No vaccination, no go. Is that the way forward in difficult times? Proof that you've been inoculated could allow travel, let businesses and schools reopen. But will it shut the door on millions and create a society of the haves and the have-nots? Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. We'll be looking at what Israel is doing with coronavirus passports and what the airline industry wants, and asking what exactly would a piece of paper actually prove. The rollout of vaccines is offering hope of a return to normal life in many countries. And if someone could prove that they have had a jab, would it be safer to open up bars, theatres and shops or allow international travel? That's where the idea of a vaccine passport comes in. Israel has started a green passport scheme allowing travel to certain restricted areas for people who've had the COVID vaccine. The government there is considering whether to use the scheme to allow access to shopping centres and restaurants. Providing proof of vaccination is not new. Some countries won't allow travellers to enter without evidence of inoculation from diseases such as yellow fever and malaria. The International Air Transport Association revealed plans to introduce a digital travel pass scheme in a bid to restart international aviation and reopen borders without quarantine. But there are some concerns about data, privacy, and the rights of people who haven't had a vaccine. And having a vaccination might not even stop a person from spreading COVID. So, are vaccine passports an item we need for the journey back to normality? I'm very pleased to say that we can welcome to the program out of Israel, in fact in Tel Aviv, Neri Zilber, journalist and adjunct fellow at the Washington Institute, who's going to tell us about Israel's green passport scheme. We say hello to aviation analyst Alex Macheras in London, and then we go to Bath in the west of England, where we see Dr. Bharat Pankhania, senior clinical lecturer at the University of Exeter Medical School. Neri, first of all, what is happening in Israel? Tell us about the green passport.
Well, as a direct result of Israel's success so far with the vaccination program, the next step that Israel is looking to is to issue these green passports for anyone who did actually get the vaccine or who has recovered from COVID, to allow them access really to leisure activities like hotels, gyms, and restaurants, and potentially international travel if there's coordination with other countries.
So that means within Israel, they can go to certain resorts, they can go into places that they want to. It's nothing to do with work or schools?
That's correct. So vaccinations here in Israel, and I imagine in other countries, won't be mandatory. It can be mandatory. And so alongside this green passport scheme that will allow Israel to reopen the economy and really act as an inducement for people to actually go and get vaccinated, there will be a parallel program where citizens can gain access to these leisure sites and events through a COVID test. And that will be effective for 72 hours. So to balance out the green passport scheme, they're allowing, let's say, non-vaccinated people to have the same option.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you about the international reaction to this, because I know that Israel wants to, hopes that international organizations will accept this as proof that Israelis can travel around the world. I'll ask you about that in a little while, but Bharat, let me come to you first of all. You're very skeptical about this, aren't you?
Yes, I am. So I really don't know what purpose it fulfills, apart from letting people know I have had a recent infection or I have had a recent immunization. So just because you've had a recent infection or a recent immunization does not mean that you are not infectious or able to infect other people. So we need to see how the vaccine behaves and what protection it gives before you can say that a fully immunized person is also immune sterile, meaning they don't get the infection and they don't infect other people. So we need to be aware of the science before we give a piece of paper to people. And the answer is, what does this piece of paper mean?
Well, as far as you're concerned, it means nothing, does it? Because you can have a vaccination. We don't know if you can become infected again, over what period of time. Does it give people a confidence that they shouldn't have?
No, so that piece of paper is exactly that. It says, I had a vaccine, fine, or I had an infection, we understand. But it doesn't then translate into, and therefore I am not infectious, therefore I will not infect other people. And so when I want to travel or take part in things, I still need to maintain all infection control measures and everything that we do in addition to having the vaccine these days. Um, in time, we will know if the vaccine is highly protective, and it is highly protective over many years or many months, etc. So at the moment, it's too early to confer anything by just giving that piece of paper.
Neri, is there a suggestion or a conversation going on that goes along the lines of Israel's rushing into this a little bit too much, bearing in mind what Bharat has just told us?
Well, in terms of the green passport scheme, it hasn't been implemented yet. This past week was really the first time that they issued detailed, health officials here did, in terms of this overall scheme. But I imagine perhaps allaying some of the medical concerns that if you do make this a requirement, say, to enter a nightclub or a restaurant, that all the people in that nightclub and restaurant were vaccinated, or at least recovered from COVID and have the antibodies. I imagine that's the logic, but really it remains to be seen in what form these passports take, and whether a barcode or an application or perhaps an actual physical piece of paper, and then how it's rolled out and implemented on the ground. And perhaps Israel might be the first one to actually implement it, so it remains to be seen.
Alex, sorry to leave you until now, but I want to bring in Qantas's chief executive, Alan Joyce, here, major Australian international airline, and he said we're looking at changing the terms and conditions to say for international travellers that we will ask people to have the vaccination before they get on the aircraft. That's Qantas's view. What about other airlines?
Well, airlines are being very cautious in even giving their stance in where they will be surrounding the post-COVID world or the next phase of this pandemic that includes vaccinations. As you correctly said, Qantas have been one of the only, if not the only airline to mention the V word regarding vaccinations, and have said outright that they believe that they will not be carrying any passengers who are not vaccinated. The industry seems to have made up its mind already. They seem to have made up its mind that A, the vaccines work, B, the vaccines prevent transmission, and C, that people will be willing to be able to take the vaccine in order to regain those freedoms like traveling. But as some of your guests have correctly said, there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know much about transmission and whether or not the vaccines will stop transmission, and that's obviously going to play a fundamental part as to whether or not the airlines and the aviation industry can use it to dictate who can enter countries or who is eligible to fly on what airlines. No airline right now wants to be the first to put their hands up and say, yes, we're following Qantas's lead. We view Qantas as part of Australia as very cautious. Their borders have been closed for a very long time now, and they have no intention to open up. They released a statement as recently as this week to say that they will not be doing anything that endangers the population of Australia with the outside world, where COVID is battering through Europe, for example. So it's a cautious approach, but the airlines and the aviation sector seem quite clear that these vaccines will be the silver bullet.
You see, what I'm wondering is whether Qantas is actually, excuse me, being cautious, as you say, but actually doing something that is better than nothing. And whether other airlines are simply saying, well, look, we'll just take people on as say-so. We won't really need to worry about it because they're incredibly scared of going out of business.
Exactly. Airlines ultimately face their largest crisis in the history of commercial flight. And you are right. There are many airlines who think, look, it's not our problem. We are not now to try to maintain the health of everybody in our cabin. So long as we are meeting the country requirements on either end, then we have no further role to play. And many airlines will be in that category because it's less headache and they throw the ball back into the court of the countries. But those airlines that belong to countries, like state-owned airlines, like national carriers, like Qantas, they almost are an extension or an arm of their governments, and we know that they will reflect the government's views regarding inoculations and vaccinations. So, as I say, the industry seems to have made up its mind, and look no further than this week in Europe, low-cost carrier Ryanair is running advertisements across the UK saying jab and fly. It says book now, jab and then go. Of course, simply impossible for the majority of the world right now, given the priority lists and given that it's not a case of a phone call and booking up a vaccine to be able to travel again. The airlines have made up their minds, but we'll see in reality how this plays out over the coming months.
Okay, so Bharat, I know you don't like the idea of a vaccine passport, but isn't what Alex is laying out there much more dangerous than having a piece of paper that says, well, hang on, look, I have had the vaccine?
It's a lot more dangerous and it's a lot more disingenuous, because when an airline says jab and fly, it is taking no responsibility that the passengers that it carries may be infected and infectious and carry their infection to other parts of the world. And I understand they are commercial organizations and their line is, that's not my problem. However, the message that gets given and translated in people's minds is, Ryanair said jab and fly, therefore it must be okay to jab and fly and drop my infection control guard. So therein, it is incumbent upon national leaders to say, just because you've been immunized doesn't mean you are not infectious and not going to infect other people, despite what our airline is telling you, get the vaccine, come and fly with us.
Neri, what is happening in Israel regarding vaccinations? Are people rushing to get jabbed, or is that not possible? Is there a queuing system? And is that partly, if they are rushing to get it, is that partly because they think this green passport might be a ticket to somewhere better?
Well, I think that's exactly right. If Ryanair is publicizing jab and fly, then I think amongst a large part of the Israeli public, it's jab and fly and get on with our normal lives again. I was in the main square here in Tel Aviv just last night, where they have a massive vaccination center, and there were about 2,000 people queuing up outside and many more inside at the hope, not even with an appointment, and ultimately the center ran out of vaccines and sent everybody home, but with the hope that they could get in and get the vaccine, at least the first shot of the Pfizer vaccine, precisely to start the process of getting back to normal. Writ large, Israel has rolled this out over the past 2.5 weeks. About 15% of the population has already been vaccinated, about 1.5 million people out of a population of 9 million. So per capita, it's a quite extraordinary rate. The one concern right now in Israel is whether vaccine supplies arrive in country to continue this fast pace. That's the real concern right now, whether they can keep it up.
Listen to this from Anna Badushi. She works at the University of Exeter, specializes in law. Digital health passports may contribute to the long-term management of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, they pose essential questions for the protection of data privacy and human rights. This is for each and every one of you. Surely, data privacy and human rights are at the back of everybody's mind at the moment. They just want to get protected. Neri?
Well, I think that's true. And look, the vaccinations themselves, but also the green passport, were a major concern going into the vaccination operation here in Israel. But just from results on the ground, demand far outstrips supply. So I think that trade-off, just in terms of people's personal choices, have been made clear. But I should go back to what I said at the top, that in parallel to the green passport scheme, the Israeli government will allow citizens to just get a COVID test, which will be valid for 72 hours, which can grant them entry into various places if they have either medical or privacy concerns.
Alex, no matter what Qantas is doing and no matter what Ryanair may well be doing, do you see it as a long-term, if you like, passport to guaranteeing the future of airline travel as a viable business to have passports of some kind in the end?
From the early days of this pandemic, that idea of the health passport, be it a digital passport, a QR code, something we show on our phones, that was something that was mentioned in almost every conversation I had with airline leaders, with senior aviation industry execs, who were saying that once the vaccines are here, that is the way out of that. That is the way out of this. That is the way back to normal life. And I think often if we look at least on a global stage, if we compare the UK to somewhere like South Korea, we know that South Korea has been very successful in suppressing the COVID-19 virus. And we know that a lot of that trade-off, as just mentioned, was to do with privacy and protection, and the fact that ultimately South Koreans can be tracked and traced right down to where they had spent on their credit card in order to know their movements. And South Koreans, at least the majority that I've spoken to and we've seen on TV, have said that they respect that trade-off because they are not sitting in stay-at-home lockdowns. They actually have relatively normal life, albeit social distance. Now, if we look at that and compare it to aviation, the UK right now is suffering the worst of all of Europe in terms of its aviation economy. South Korea was home in 2020 to the only two airlines on earth that declared profits. Those two airlines declared profits much unlike every other carrier on the planet because, again, they had effectively caught up with their health crisis and then looked to the economy. And I think when you realize that it's the virus that's killing the economy, not the restrictions, leaders are naturally looking to anything that can prove that at least part of the population are safe, have been vaccinated, and they say it's inevitable that that will be some kind of health passport and probably digital.
Okay, so Bharat, some kind of indication that you are no longer a danger to others is probably going to come along. What needs to be achieved for that to be the case? Where are we now in the scale of beating this pandemic that I could eventually have something that says I'm no longer infectious, I'm no longer a danger to others?
Okay, so what we need to do is do what we know. And so once you are fully immunized, and then we have observed you and a large sector of the population to how well a fully immunized population performs, we will be in a better position to be able to tell if having a full immunization course of the two gives you a degree of protection, i.e., you don't get infected, you don't infect others. Wonderful. We have a large population infected, immunized, but not spreading infection, or if they do, it is only a mild illness. Once we know, we will be in a better position. So thinking forward, going forward many months, I'm not totally against a piece of paper which says this is a person who has been immunized. And my reasoning is as follows. That piece of paper gives me an indication that actually this person is less likely to be infectious, infected, compared to somebody who has not been immunized at all. So there is some merit, but we need to know exactly what merit there is in that piece of paper before we start imposing it.
At the moment, as I understand it, having an inoculation simply means that you are less likely to get severely ill. It doesn't mean that you are protected against the disease in the long term. It doesn't mean that you can't pass it on to other people. So in your opinion, Doctor, how, you say months, could it be years before we arrive at the point you've just described?
No, it won't be years, because we will know when we've immunized a substantial population and followed them over, say, 6 months or so. We will have a pretty good indication of how well the vaccine program is working, and is it inducing lasting immunity? Is it causing people to be immune sterile, meaning they don't get infected and therefore they don't pass on infections to others? We will know that very soon.
Neri, let me ask you about Israel in particular. You are there. You've been studying what's been going on. Is Israel proud of what it's doing in terms of not just the green passports, but in terms of an inoculation program and in terms of keeping the level of infections down? Where does it stand?
Well, I should mention that the infection levels are actually quite high. So per capita, Israel is almost or surpassed even American levels. It's not quite at UK levels, but it's not too far off. So in terms of managing the pandemic, there's a lot of work to be done. But like you said, the vaccination program in just 2.5 weeks since it was launched is setting records worldwide. And that there's a variety of reasons for that. But the government led by the long-serving Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, you can be sure is taking both domestic credit and international credit for the job it's done. And Israelis on the whole are very grateful at the fact that perhaps by March or April, the pandemic may be behind at least one country in the world.
And what about its suggestion, the government's suggestion, that it hopes these green passports will allow Israelis not just to travel to certain places within their own country, but would become more widely accepted internationally? Has that idea been taken up by other countries?
Well, I personally don't know, but the Israeli government says that they're in conversations with other countries in terms of them accepting the green passport scheme. I think it also has to do with the fact that, while Israel may come out of the pandemic earlier than other places, there may not be many places to travel to if much of the world is still on lockdown.
Alex, do you see a time coming up fairly soon when we do have, as I mentioned at the beginning, the haves and the have-nots? I've got a piece of paper that says I'm okay. Airlines will continue to take them. And the have-nots who haven't been able to, because of the nature of their country, get any kind of vaccine, that we will see, if you like, a class war in terms of air travel.
I do, and I fear that actually, because air travel should be accessible to all. It was before the pandemic already an area of society that a lot of people was simply out of reach, and while we're lucky in Europe, for example, and in the West, it's just not the same. The same cannot be said for other nations, African nations, for example. I think it's important to remember always a quote from Dr. Tedros at the World Health Organization, which is that nobody is safe until everybody is safe. And ultimately, we do risk becoming a very insular part of society whereby we're all flashing about these fancy digital health passes because our government secured early doses of the vaccines. Meanwhile, we're literally cutting off other parts of the world that were not so lucky to be able to place mass vaccination orders, that are sitting patiently, that will perhaps have COVID rife because ultimately they are on their own while the rest of the world tries to move on and get back to normal. It is very dangerous territory. What I will ask my fellow panelist here, the doctor, regarding the paper that you said you were comfortable with, where you could show that you've had a recent inoculation vaccination, do we not risk territory there in that we're already seeing something now, a concept whereby people are using fake certificates to show airlines that they have tested negative for COVID-19. And of course, the innocent check-in agent at the airport is not second guessing these certificates and they're waving them through. Is that not going to be the same?
Let's ask Bharat that one.
Yeah.
Any idea what's happening here?
Alex, I agree with you, because it leads to either fraud, corruption. People make up these pieces of paper depending on how the security of the passport is. But at the same time, whilst a piece of paper saying this person is immunized, a genuine piece of paper, gives you some degree of confidence that they are less likely to be infectious to others, it's not a guarantee. It's just a slight edge on other people who have not been immunized. Overall, I agree with you very much, and the WHO, which is no one is safe until everyone is safe. And we really need to be aiming for immunized nationally, immunized internationally. And when you have brought down case numbers internationally, we know that we are living in a safer world.
But you are, I would say, Bharat, since the last time you came on Roundtable and gave us the benefit of your expertise, you are more hopeful about the direction in which we're traveling now?
I'm always hopeful, and with the licensing of the vaccines, it is a clear indication that we've got the armamentum, i.e. the vaccines, which will protect the population. Now, how long it protects us for, we don't know. All those are unknowns. But the fact is that the vaccines appear to work, one. And number two, they appear to prevent severe disease. That's fantastic. That's really good news, because even if the vaccines don't work, but they prevent you from severe disease and stop you from dying, that is a result. That is a good result. And one more thing, if I may add, now that we have managed to get these vaccines to show that they work, I see advances in these vaccines for other infectious diseases as well. Dengue fever, other things that we've not been able to manage, maybe even better quality vaccines, etc. So I'm very hopeful with the invention of this new platform of vaccines.
So we start 2021 with a little bit more hope than we had perhaps even 4 or 5 months ago. But if you go back 12 months, we had no idea what was on its way towards us. Thank you very much for coming on the program. Every single answer, it appears, throws up more questions, and it will continue to do so. Thank you for coming on Roundtable, and wherever you are watching this program, join us again another time. Until then,
thank you.
from me, David Foster, and the team, goodbye.